They called it the Wild West. But it wasn't just wild because of gunfights and gold mines. It was wild because it was complicated, messy, human. It was filled with people whose stories were never meant to be told. When we think of the American West, we imagine rugged cowboys, saloons, stagecoaches, and the chase for gold. But that version of history, clean, heroic, whitewashed, is a myth crafted by Hollywood and textbooks. The real West was darker, richer, more diverse, more brutal. It was a place of ambition and violence, of dreams built on stolen land, of survival at the edges of law, morality, and memory. And the truth was buried beneath centuries of propaganda. This is the story of the West as it really was, of those who lived it and those who were erased from it. The cowboy is America's favorite folk hero, brave, free, and just. But the real cowboy was a working man, often poor, often not white. Up to 1 in 4 cowboys were African American. Many others were Mexican, Native American, or immigrants. They didn't ride off into the sunset. They worked long, grueling hours under a scorching sun. The word cowboy itself was once derogatory. It implied low status. The elite herders were called cattlemen. Cowboy was a term reserved for the rough, the young, the expendable. Yet, Hollywood turned the cowboy into a symbol of white masculinity. John Wayne never showed calloused hands or dusty lungs. The real cowboys didn't duel at high noon. They died in stampedes, disease, and poverty. They herded cattle through hostile terrain, braved rattlesnakes, outlaws, and vigilante justice. And most of their names are lost to history. The Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't bring freedom. Thousands of newly emancipated men and women headed west, chasing a dream that was denied to them in the South. Some became buffalo soldiers, black regiments in the U.S. Army sent to fight Native Americans and guard outposts. Others became cowboys, farmers, and even lawmen. One of the greatest frontier legends was Bass Reeves, a black deputy marshal who arrested over 3,000 outlaws. He rode alone, spoke native languages, wore disguises, and never backed down. Many believe he was the true inspiration for the Lone Ranger, but few know his name. African Americans founded towns like Nicodemus in Kansas, Boley in Oklahoma, havens for black prosperity in a still hostile world. But they faced raids, racism, and redlining. Their legacy remains in broken buildings, forgotten cemeteries, and stories passed down in whispers. Before the cowboy, before the railroad, before the settlers, there were nations. Powerful, complex, sovereign nations that lived on and with the land. The Lakota, the Apache, the Comanche, the Navajo. They were not passive victims. They fought hard. When settlers pushed west under the banner of manifest destiny, it wasn't exploration, it was invasion. The U.S. government broke every treaty it ever made with native tribes. In 1864, U.S. troops slaughtered more than 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children, in the Sand Creek Massacre. In 1890, nearly 300 Lakota were killed at Wounded Knee, marking the end of native armed resistance. But resistance never ended. It became cultural, spiritual, linguistic. Today, languages once outlawed are being revived. Tribal nations are reclaiming history, one truth at a time. Long before Texas was American, it was Tejos. Before cowboys, there were vaqueros, the horsemen of Spanish Mexico. They invented the lasso, the saddle horn, the chaps, everything we associate with cowboy life. But when the U.S. seized Mexican land after the 1848 war, Vaqueros became second-class citizens in their own territory. Their land was taken, their culture mocked, their names erased. Anglo settlers claimed to have invented the cowboy way, but they wore it like a stolen costume. The border wasn't always a wall. It was a bleeding edge where culture, power, and identity clashed. Mexican Americans faced lynchings, forced labor, and Americanization, but they never vanished. They became ranchers, musicians, labor leaders, revolutionaries. They were the West, and still are. The West was not just a man's world. Women homesteaded land, ran businesses, healed the sick, and defended homes with rifles. Some became outlaws, like Belstar. Others were warriors, like Lozon of the Apache, a mystic fighter who rode with Geronimo. Many were survivalists, raising children in sod houses, burying husbands, defending farms alone. Others were sex workers, often by necessity, trapped in boomtown economies where men outnumbered women 20-1. Their lives were brutal, often short, but essential. They wrote diaries, ran schools, fed towns, and defied every gender role society tried to assign them. Some even became sheriffs, like Frances Clayton, who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Civil War before heading west. Their stories are mostly gone, scattered in letters, half-facts, and forgotten cemeteries. They came by the thousands from Guangdong across the ocean, chasing Gold Mountain. They ended up digging tunnels through mountains, laying tracks across deserts, building the transcontinental railroad. They were paid less, given the most dangerous jobs, beaten, killed, forgotten. When the railroad was completed, they were erased from the photo. Then came the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The first major federal law banning a specific race. Chinatowns burned, families were separated, citizenships denied, yet they stayed. They fought, they built towns, opened laundries, saved money, sent children to school. They were pioneers, just like any others, but denied the title. The line between outlaw and lawman was blurry. Wyatt Earp shot unarmed men. Billy the Kid was part freedom fighter, part killer. Jesse James was a Confederate terrorist turned folk hero. The West glorified violence, but it wasn't about good versus evil. It was about power, land, and who got to write the story afterward. Gunslingers were often criminals, bounty hunters, or both. And behind every duel was a land dispute, a railroad, or a political grudge. The real outlaws were sometimes the sheriffs themselves. All across the West are towns that no longer exist. Towns built by dreamers, burned by hate, or swallowed by dust. Black towns like Boli, Chinese camps, abandoned after railroad layoffs. Indigenous villages, raised to make room for railroads or ranches. Each town had names, stories, people, now they're footnotes, or forgotten altogether. But the ruins are still there, if you know where to look. The gold rush made some men rich, and destroyed countless others. It brought violence, disease, and corruption. It devastated indigenous land and sacred sites. Laws were ignored. Murder was common. Women were trafficked. Chinese miners were lynched. For every one man who struck gold, 100 were buried in poverty or in the ground. The wealth flowed east. The scars stayed in California. Native children were taken from their families, forced into boarding schools with shaved heads, English-only rules, and Christian conversion. Kill the Indian, save the man. They were beaten for speaking their language, taught that their families were savages. Some died. Many never went home. These schools operated well into the 20th century. Their legacy is generational trauma, and a long road to healing. Religion wasn't just salvation, it was colonization. Missionaries came to civilize native peoples. Mormons fled persecution and created their own empire. Clashing with the U.S. Army in Utah, priests turned villages into tools of assimilation. And through it all, indigenous spiritual practices were banned, called devil worship. It wasn't just a war for land. It was a war for the soul of the West. The cowboy movies lied. They made the West clean, white, simple. They turned genocide into progress. They erased every voice that didn't fit the narrative. But slowly, that's changing. Historians, filmmakers, and indigenous voices are reclaiming the truth. Not because they hate America, but because they believe we all deserve to know it. Truth is power, and it's time the West told the whole story. The American West is more than a myth. It's a story still unfolding, and it belongs to everyone who lived it, not just the ones who wrote it down. History isn't clean, it's complicated. But when we uncover the past, we finally begin to understand the present. Like this video, if you believe in real history, comment a story you'd like to see told. Subscribe for more forgotten truths, because the past isn't dead. It's still shaping us today.